Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another session with the great Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Ba'li rahimahullah ta'ala. Looking at Kitab al-Hajj, the Imam says, وَهُوَ فَرْضُ كِفَايَةٍ كُلَّ عَامٍ وهو قصد مكة لعمل مخصوص في زمن مخصوص وهو أحد أركان الإسلام والأمرة زيارة البيت على وجه مخصوص ويجبان في العمر مرة بخمسة شروط وهي الإسلام والعقل فلا يصحان من كافر ومجنون ولو أحرم عنه وليه والبلوغ وكمال الحرية ولكن يصحان من الصغير والرقيق. Okay, so right off the bat, the Imam and our author rahimahullah ta'ala, he says it is a communal obligation every year, and of course we're talking about Hajj. So وَهُوَ فَرْضُ كِفَايَةٍ كُلَّ عَامٍ, it is a communal obligation every year. That is, that the Hajj as a whole is to be established as a duty upon the ummah at large, so that the Kaaba is never left without visitors and worshippers. So each year, some of the Muslims must perform the pilgrimage, even though it's not individually required upon everyone at all times. It's the difference between the individual obligation versus the general communal obligation of Hajj being performed. As we'll understand shortly, and as he mentions here, it's a pillar of Islam. It has to be performed once in a lifetime. That's when he shifts from communal to individual obligation. And he defines this by saying, وَهُوَ قَصْدُ مَكَّةَ لِعَمَلٍ مَخْصُوصٍ فِي زَمَنٍ مَخْصُوصٍ. It is the intention and journey to Mecca for a specific or for specific acts at specific times. So this is kind of the definition of Hajj, meaning here that Hajj is to set out to Mecca with the purpose of performing certain rites and rituals, acts of worship such as standing at Arafah, making tawaf, performing the sa'i, and of course this is during the appointed months known as the months of Hajj. And it is one of the pillars of Islam. Hajj, among the 5 fundamental acts of worship upon which the entirety of the religion stands. And this is mentioned in the hadith of Ibn Umar. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, Buni al-Islamu ala khams. That Islam has been built upon 5. And among those 5 things, as we know, are the 5 pillars of Islam, including the Hajj. All right, so not only is it an obligation, but it is a pillar. Even more so, a pillar of the religion. Umrah is visiting the sacred house in a prescribed manner. That is, to visit the Kaaba, intending worship by performing tawaf and sa'i, cutting or shaving the hair after having entered into ihram. So this is what's typically referred to as the lesser pilgrimage. Both are obligatory once in a lifetime. And this is established in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in one verse, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجَّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. Essentially, and to Allah upon mankind is Hajj, making the Hajj to the house for those who are capable of doing it. And there's another verse, إِنَّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ, that both the Hajj and the Umrah are for Allah. The Prophet ﷺ was also about the requirement of this being performed every year. He said, if I had said yes to it being a requirement every year, like prayer is a requirement every day, he said, if I had said yes, it would have become obligatory, and you would not have been able to do it. And so therefore it is obligatory once in a lifetime as opposed to once every year. And that obligation is based on, he says, 5 prerequisites. The first is Islam and sanity, neither valid from a disbeliever or the insane, even if their guardian makes ihram on their behalf, talking about the majnoon. Right? If the guardian of the majnoon were to make ihram on their behalf, it still would not be valid. Puberty and complete freedom are from the other conditions, though valid from a minor or bond servant. Essentially here, Hajj and Umrah are valid only from a Muslim who is sane, of sound mind. Worship is not accepted without faith or mental faculty, the ability to understand. They become obligatory only for one who has reached maturity and enjoys full freedom, meaning they're not in bondage, whether that's fully a bondservant or partially thereof. So we're looking at the various different grades of the prerequisite or conditions here. As for sufficiency, meaning what fulfills the lifelong duty, it applies only once these conditions are met. Thus, the Hajj or Umrah of a child or a servant is valid in form but does not discharge the obligation. It would not fulfill the obligation of their Hajj or their Umrah, and so they would be required later, once they reach puberty, or were completely freed from bondage, then they would have to fulfill this pillar of Islam. Anything done prior to that would be considered a voluntary act of worship. So here the Imam is drawing our attention not only to the basics of this requirement, but highlighting for us the difference between shart sihha, which is a condition or prerequisite of validity, and then shart wujub, which is the prerequisite of obligation, and then there's shart ijza, which is the prerequisite of fulfillment. These are the 3 levels of the the prerequisites there. So sihha meaning it's valid, and we've talked about it's not valid from the disbeliever or from the insane. Meaning if they were to do it, it's not even valid. Wujub, here it's an obligation. So we know that minors and bondservants, they can perform it, but they're not obliged because of their age or their status in terms of being free or not. It's still valid, right? They've fulfilled shart sihha. They are of sound mind. They are Muslim. It's just that issue of whether or not it's actually obligatory for them. No, not in this case. And then shart ijza, meaning that it will be sufficient and fulfill the obligation. That goes back to the age. So once they reach puberty, or a person that's in bondage once they have been fully freed. He says, وَيُحْرِمُ عَنِ الصَّغِيرِ وَلِيُّهُ وَلَا يُجْزِئَانِ عَنْ حَجَّةِ الْإِسْلَامِ وَأُمْرَتِهِ فَإِنْ بَلَغَ الصَّغِيرُ أَوْ أُتِقَ الرَّقِيقُ قَبْلَ الْوُقُوفِ أَوْ بَعْدَهُ إِنْ أَعَادَ فَوَقَفَ فِي وَقْتِهِ أَجْزَأَهُ عَنْ حَجَّةِ الْإِسْلَامِ وَالْخَامِسُ الِاسْتِطَاعَةُ وهي ملك زاد وراحلة تصلح لمثله أو ملك ما يقدر به على تحصيل ذلك بشرط كونه فاضلا عما يحتاجه من كتب ومسكن وخادم وعن مؤنته ومؤنة عياله على الدوام. All right. Getting back into this issue, the minor's guardian makes ihram on their behalf. So he's now essentially giving us a little bit more detail as to how we would understand the ihram working for a minor. So that basically means that the child's father, the wali in this case, which would typically be the father, or a guardian, a legal guardian, or one acting on their behalf, may declare the child's intention and enter them into the state of ihram. A minor who cannot yet discern. He cannot make the discernment between what is an intention or not. And we've talked about in the madhab there being a definitive age for that, which is 7 and above your mumayyiz. Anything below 7, you're not considered mumayyiz, and therefore the intention, if you were to try and formulate one within a child below that age, they haven't reached the point in which it's considered legally viable. They're unable to formulate essentially a valid intention by way of the legal scope. Right? There may be some like 6-year-olds that are quite savvy, even some 5-year-olds that have been well trained and educated. We're not always talking about like a natural occurring reality. Some things are simply within a legal scope or a legal framework. Much like menstruation of a woman. In the madhab, once you're past 50 years old, they don't consider this hayd. Even if the woman still experiences natural bleeding on a regular monthly cycle, that might be the case in the natural world and it occurs, but within the legal scope, they say after this, we're not legally considering that to be menstrual blood. So she would maintain her prayers as if it was not occurring. Or if it was istihada, I should say, as if it was just like pseudo-menstruation, which you work with. Right, so here, this is basically giving us a similar situation in that regard. And this is based on the report that a woman lifted up her child and asked the Prophet, is there Hajj for this one? And he replied, yes, and you will have a reward. So the act is valid and rewarded even though the child is not yet accountable. So basically, again, it's like a voluntary deed in their scale. And then the parent for being the one that's facilitating that will also get a reward. These do not suffice for the Hajj or Umrah of Islam, meaning that the Hajj and Umrah performed by a child, they do not count for their lifelong obligation, which is the Hajjatul Islam. Because that condition is based on, or that outcome is based on fulfilling the condition of maturity or bulugh. And that bulugh is shart wujub. There's a prerequisite for obligation. You have to have reached the age of maturity. Maybe not like you're a mature person, as we might say culturally, but legal maturity. Legal maturity is defined by several signs that we've come to understand. Right? Whether it's certain areas of body hair, or even reaching a point in their life by way of age, 15 being the max. If none of those signs have become present and obvious, then the age of 15, it means you're considered baligh, and after that, whatever happens, you're accountable. Right? So this is highlighting for us the fact that a minor, someone under that age, they're not obliged, and so they haven't been able to fulfill an obligation because there is no obligation to fulfill in the first place. So they would have to fulfill that later on. It would be valid, sahih, but it would not be considered mujzi, not sufficient in fulfilling the obligation. He says if a minor reaches puberty or a bondservant is freed before the standing or after it, they repeat it and stand within its time, it suffices for their obligatory Hajj. And so that means that if a child, prepubescent, or a bondservant begins the pilgrimage while still not fully accountable yet, they're still in bondage, they're still prepubescent, and then that child reaches puberty or maturity, or that bondservant is freed for whatever reason. Maybe the owner said, if we make it to Mecca and I can go on Hajj, you're free. And he starts, and then he frees the guy. Okay? And if this happens before or during the standing at Arafah, or as he mentions, shortly after that, and they repeat the standing within its time, meaning if they're there at Arafah, they're good. But if they leave and then maturity strikes or freedom is granted and they can come back to Arafah within its fixed time, then it will be sufficient for them and count for their Hajj. And that's because the essential pillars of Hajj occurred while the person was qualified for obligation. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, al-Hajju Arafah, that pilgrimage is Arafah, meaning the standing there, fil mawqif. But if maturity or freedom occurs after that time is expired, meaning even if they were to go back to a physical location, now it's too late. The definitive time for Arafah has expired, the act remains voluntary, and the obligatory Hajj must be performed later. So there is leeway, some leniency here, so long as they're able to fulfill this portion of the Hajj before its time runs out. The fifth condition is capability, istita'a. What does that mean exactly? Once in a lifetime for those who are capable of going. That's defined, he says, as ownership of provisions and suitable transport or means to obtain them on the condition that it is beyond what is needed for books, residence, servants, and the continuing maintenance of oneself and one's dependents. So this capability, capacity, or ability here, being the fifth condition, is also min shurut al-wujub, the prerequisites of obligation, which means if you don't fulfill this condition or prerequisite, Hajj is not obligatory upon you. And what it means is that a person possesses avenues of travel. Either they have the medium of travel, whether it's a car, whether they own a plane, whether they're going on bike, right? They're going to cycle all the way to Mecca. It's happened. Or if they have the ability to walk or ride on an animal. Or they might not possess the means to reach Mecca safely and comfortably. So this suitable transport, as you'll note here, not only is it the zad, but rahila, the rahila tasluhu lahu. The zad does not have a connection to what is appropriate for the person, meaning your provisions. You could have food supplies that are lesser than what you typically would enjoy and eat in your daily life. That's typical of travel for most people, is that they're not sitting down to their moms cooking, made with love. They're typically like, they've either packed something or they're buying things along the way. And when you buy things along the way, the love often isn't there. And so the flavors are lost. Right? Yep, exactly. And some people, from what I hear, is if it's not made with love, I'm not eating it. And I can't blame them for that. Yeah. Water and rice cakes for me, please. But the issue of transport, he says, a suitable transport that you can possess, that you either possess suitable transport or that you can afford suitable transport, which means now you're going to consider what it is that you typically utilize for transportation. So if you could walk, but you don't walk distances like that, or you could ride your cycle, but you don't cycle like that, that's not how you get around, and you can't afford the typical means of transportation that you utilize, then just because I have a bike doesn't mean I'm obliged now to take that bike and journey to Mecca. Isn't that great? I mean, many of us have the capacity to walk great distances over a long duration of time, but that's not what's typical or suitable for many of us when it comes to getting around from place to place. And so therefore, if we don't possess or have the ability to take suitable transport, we're not obliged to go. And then you have to consider the capacity, your financial capacity when it comes to either purchasing the provisions or providing yourself with transport, that it must, as he says, be in addition to what is required of your ongoing needs personally and those of your dependents, which essentially states that if you have to empty your account, you have just enough in your account, let's say for example, for the price of Hajj to go and to come back, to house yourself, to feed yourself, to handle your basic affairs throughout the journey, and that's all you have, and that if you drained all of that, you would leave nothing for your family or the people that were dependent upon you while you were traveling, and they would be left in the lurch. And then you might return and there's absolutely nothing, so now you're in a big old mess. Then in that case, you simply don't have enough in order to fulfill this condition. And that includes things like housing. So if you're going to take out of your housing allowance in order to make Hajj and skip a housing payment, and then you're going to lose your house, or the daily maintenance, like the tools that might be required, or even books of knowledge. Again, this is another section which highlights the value and the virtue of knowledge, kutubu ilm, the books of knowledge here. We're not talking about like reading, writing, and arithmetic books, science and biology and stuff. We're talking about knowledge of the deen, these books, or a livelihood, or the tools of your livelihood, essentially, along with taking care of the family members and being able to leave something behind. So a person who has these means is deemed capable, and they must perform Hajj immediately. If they're forced to sell items in order to get the amount, like if they think, well, I got to sell some stuff and then I could go, that's not a requirement in order to reach this condition. Islam, the law of Islam doesn't put that level of hardship on its adherents. So he goes on and he says, فَمَنْ كَمُلَتْ لَهُ هَذِهِ الشُّرُوطِ لَزِمَهُ السَّعْيُ فَوْرًا إِنْ كَانَ فِي الطَّرِيقِ أَمْنٌ فإن عجز عنه لكبر أو مرض لا يرجى برؤه لزمه أن يقيم نائبا حرا ولو امرأة يحج ويعتمر عنه من حيث وجب ولا يصح ممن لم يحج عن نفسه حج عن فرض غيره ولا عن نذر ولا نافلة فإن فعل انصرف إلى حجة الإسلام. ويزيد الأنثى شرطا سادسا وهو أن تجد لها زوجا أو محرما مكلفا وأن تقدر على الزاد والراحلة لها وله فإن أيست منه استنابت وإن حجت بلا محرم حرم وأجزأ. Whoever fulfills these prerequisites is immediately obliged to set out so long as the way is safe. And this is an important note here from the principles of the Hanbali madhab, is that al-amr yufid al-wujub, right? We understand the command, it entails an obligation al-fawr, which must be fulfilled immediately. It has to be done right away. You can't delay obligations unless there's a window of time in which you've been afforded, unless there's something within the law that allows for delayment or a window of time. If it's not specified, then it goes on the baseline ruling or understanding, which is obligations, commands constitute obligations which must be fulfilled immediately. And a great example of this, just rationally is, besides the Hajj here, is when a parent gives an order to their child and they say, take the trash out, what's understood? Can the child come and say, you know, you come back and you say, why didn't you take the trash out? And you say, well, I'm going to next week. I'm not being disobedient. I'm going to do what you said. 100% with ihsan. In fact, I'll even wash out the trash can as a little bonus. But I'm not doing it right now because I'm busy and I'll do it next week. What do you think? Does that sound logical? No. That's not how we understand commands. That being said, there are other madhabs that allow delay. They allow delay, and they have their evidence that they use based on the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so they have their evidence in which they believe that this obligation can be delayed. In the madhab, however, it's clearly stated in the most beginner level of text like this one, lazimahu as-sa'yu fawran. They must make haste. They must go immediately, so long as the way is safe. Okay, so this is another part of that condition, that the road or the route is safe. And this is a part of that condition of istita'a, of capacity or ability. So if the journey is unsafe, it could be due to fear of life, property, or one's honor, the obligation is suspended until safety is restored. So in the event that you think, undergoing such a journey, I'm going to put myself in peril, either by way of my life or my property or dignity or my honor, then you're not obliged to go, and you wait until it's restored. If they're unable to do so due to old age or chronic illness, he states here, this basically means that a person has a permanent lack of physical ability to undertake the journey, whether that's through old age or a lasting illness that prevents travel. And in that case, a free proxy. A proxy is a na'ib. It's somebody that's going to act on your behalf. Even if female, must perform both Hajj and Umrah on their own behalf from the place at which they became obligatory. On their behalf, not their own behalf, on their behalf, meaning on behalf of the one who is unable to go due to old age or chronic illness. So they would have that proxy do it from the place at which they, both Hajj and Umrah, became obligatory. So the ruling here is talking about what's known as Hajj al-Badl. Al-Badl is the substitute, or the substitute Hajj or Umrah. So one is essentially deputized by the individual unable to go to perform the rites and rituals with the intention that they're doing it on behalf of the person who appointed them. And it has to be from the location where the obligation became due, whether that be their homeland or wherever they were residing when capacity first was attained. So basically that means if you're here in the United States and now you're obliged to go on Hajj, but you fall in this category, old age or chronic illness, and you're just not going to be able to travel, and you need to now appoint somebody, it has to be done from here. You can't appoint somebody living in Mecca. The trip will be very different, won't it? Somebody going from Mecca as opposed to somebody going from here. Basically, they have to be a deputy, which means they're going to go through the same things that you're going to go through. They're going to travel the distance. They're going to spend. They're going to sacrifice the amount that you would essentially sacrifice. And the proxy must be free and Islamically competent. They have to know what they're doing. You can't appoint one ignorant person that doesn't understand how to make these things happen. You need somebody that has know-how. And as he mentions here, your proxy doesn't have to be a male. It can be a female as well. A woman can serve as a lawful deputy in this case. Of course, the conditions are also will apply to her when it comes to her type of travel, etc. It's not valid for someone who has not performed Hajj for themselves to perform the obligatory, vowed, or voluntary Hajj on behalf of another. So the obligatory Hajj is the one of Islam. Then you have a Hajj al-Nadhr. It became obligatory by way of a vow, or even a Hajj Tatawwu', which is a voluntary, or Hajj Nafila, a voluntary Hajj. Essentially what he's saying here is that the deputy must have completed their own Hajj, their own obligatory Hajj. Not one as a minor, not one as a bondservant, a voluntary Hajj, but they've completed their own Hajjatul Islam. Their own pillar of Islam has been performed for themselves. As the Prophet ﷺ once asked about this, someone who was going to perform Hajj for another, he said, perform Hajj for yourself first, and then for Shubrama, who was the individual that we're going to perform Hajj on behalf of. And this essentially ensures that the person performing the rites, they do so fulfilling their own obligation, obviously, and then they have some understanding and sincerity, not out of substitution before personal fulfillment. If the deputy, that he says, if they do so, it's redirected to their own Hajj of Islam, meaning that if that deputy had not performed their Hajj and they themselves intended to go make it on behalf of another, a badal, as a deputy, it won't count for the one that's deputized them, but it'll count for their own Hajj, their own obligatory Hajj. This is because the intention here cannot precede the fulfillment of one's own personal duty. It will just be redirected back to that individual in order to fulfill their obligation. The sixth prerequisite. So the first five are inclusive of everyone, both male and female, inclusive of all. Then there's a sixth category or condition which is applicable to females only. The sixth prerequisite applies to women, that she find a husband or a mahram of legal capacity, and that she be able to afford provisions and transport for herself and for him. Whoa! Whoa! That just turned the whole paradigm upside down. What is that about? Astaghfirullah. You know what I mean? All this time I was thinking that was my job. So we got to put down the basics of Islam in the contract so that we are clear on what it says. Then that's different. Yeah, if your mahar is, I'll pay for your Hajj, then that's the mahar. But if that's not in there, then, sweetheart, I travel first class. Movenpick, please. Front row. All right, all jokes aside. All right, for a woman, having a mahram, whether that's her husband or another male who is impermissible for her to marry, al-ʿābid, permanently so, to accompany her along the journey is a part of istata'ah. It's a part of her capacity. And that male must be legally suitable to make the journey. That is, number one, they have to be Muslim. So a woman might have, a Muslim woman might have a non-Muslim father. And that man, even though he's her father, the legal definition of mahram does not apply. That doesn't mean that she can marry her father. If someone were to say, well, if he's not a mahram, then no. We're talking about legal terms now, not natural understandings, right? Because naturally that's also understood. Like you don't marry your father, you don't marry your brother, like those things don't require that mahramiyah to understand within the framework of Islam, right? But here we're talking about the legal term of what a mahram is and what makes a person a valid mahram. And one of those conditions of being a valid mahram is that they're Muslim, that they're sane, and that they are mature. That they're mature. So if you had a son, a Muslim son, who's like 5 or 6, 7 or 8, then that's not going to count as a mahram either, because the purpose of the mahram is not just symbolic in nature, it's one of utility. Okay, because traveling the world, you're in the realm of men. And you're going to run into men. And a woman should not be made to deal in the realm of men. it doesn't mean that she can't do it. It's not an issue of, is she capable of doing it? There are women that can handle themselves in the realm of men. We call them boss ladies today. But in Islam, we don't throw women into these environments. We protect their femininity. And we preserve that dignity. So that when she has to go out into the world of men, beyond what's required within her locality, she needs a man in order to deal with that world of men. It's not only for that, being able to deal with other males, but it's also a factor of safety. And I'm sure that if we were to do a little research, we would find that in modern terms, that is the case as well. The presence of a male is probably, has been proven to be a deterrent for being accosted. A lone solo female being accosted by another male, the presence of a male is a deterrent. He might not be able to do anything because he's not capable of maybe even handling his own self in defense, but just the presence alone is enough. So this condition again safeguards her dignity and her well-being during the journey. He says if she's discouraged by that, it might not be the best translation. Essentially, if she's unable to fulfill all of that, not only does she have to be able to afford her way, but also his way. If she's discouraged by that, she appoints a proxy, meaning if she's otherwise capable but has no mahram to accompany her or has no ability to do that, to have a mahram accompany her, then she may deputize another to perform the obligatory Hajj on behalf of herself, just as one unable to travel due to illness. If she performs Hajj without a mahram, it is valid though impermissible. That is, the Hajj is accepted. Okay? For the rites themselves to be sound, the mahram is not a condition of that. But, based on the madhab, she incurs a sin for traveling without a lawful companion. And here we can see that the Hanbali jurists differentiate between the validity of the act and the prohibition of the means. The Hajj fulfills its ritual requirement, but violates the travel restriction. So travel restriction is just a means toward fulfilling the obligation, whereas the Hajj in and of itself is not attached to its rites and rituals attached to that Hajj. And I will point out, just as a note so that we don't get overly worried or upset when we note some women perhaps making Hajj or Umrah on their own or traveling without a mahram. There are other views that say if the way is safe, the travel for Hajj is permissible. Not sightseeing, just seeing the world, vacationing. If to fulfill this obligation, the way is safe, and some even stipulate they travel in a group. Right? So now the concept, the goal of it is being achieved. They travel with a trustworthy group and the way is safe. Then the objective of the mahram is achieved. Then they can go and fulfill this obligation without incurring a sin. Okay, that is a view that's out there. Even within some of the scholars of the madhab, they hold this particular view. However, the official position the preponderant position is that it is impermissible, and so a woman should understand that she's not obliged to go if she's unable to meet this condition, and so she shouldn't feel obligated. She shouldn't feel guilty or worried. In fact, she should feel the other way. I really want to go, but I can't fulfill this obligation, and I'll incur a sin, so it's better for me that I don't go. And in that occasion, if she's actively restraining herself from committing a sin, she's being rewarded. Because Islam is not only about what it is that you do, but it's also about what you intentionally avoid. What you intentionally avoid is rewarding, as opposed to just not doing things. Like right now, us here present, we're not drinking alcohol. It's tea. But we're not intentionally not doing that. So it's not like we're getting rewarded for not doing all the sins in the world. Okay? But if that was presented, or we were encouraged, or we were enticed, or we had a driving factor within us, I want to do this, I crave to do this, and I intentionally am not doing it, then in that case you would be rewarded for your refrainment and avoidance of sin. And so in this event, I draw your attention by way of parable or illustration so that the sisters could understand that, look, in this instance, you're actually, because if you have this drive and this desire, I really want to go, I want to see the Kaaba, I really have the money, I could do it all by myself, I can make it, I've traveled before, I know how to do it, I know the plane, I know the train, blah, 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 blah. You could say, look, you're actually being rewarded at this moment for your withholding. The next section, he says, وَالْمَوَاقِيتُ مَوَاضِعُ وَأَزْمِنَةٌ مُعَيَّنَةٌ لِعِبَادَةٍ مَخْصُوصَةٍ فَمِقَاتُ أَهْلِ الْمَدِينَةِ ذُو الْحُلَيْفَةِ وَالشَّامِ وَمِصْرَ وَالْمَغْرِبِ الْجُحْفَةِ وَالْيَمَنِ يَلَمْلَمْ وَنَجْدِ الْحِجَازِ وَالْيَمَنِ وَالطَّائِفِ قَرْنٌ وَالْمَشْرِقِ ذَاتُ عِرْقٍ وَهَذِهِ لِأَهْلِهَا وَلِمَنْ مَرَّ عَلَيْهَا ومن منزله دونها فميقاته منه ويحرم من بمكة لحج منها ويصح من الحل ولا دم عليه ولعمرة من الحل ويصح من مكة وعليه دم. So the next section in this chapter is about the mawaqit, which is the plural for miqat. The miqats are designated places and times, both place and time, as he says, azmina, he says mawadi'u wa azmina, both places and times for specific acts of worship. So the word miqat, again the plural mawaqit, it really means, right down at its core linguistic meaning, a limit or a boundary. And in the sacred law, it refers to the appointed locations and times established for entering into ihram, which is the state of consecration required for Hajj and Umrah. So the miqats, they serve both as spatial and temporal boundaries. You like that? Making where and when a person begins, or marking where and when a person begins their rites and rituals. And then he just lists them out. The miqat of the people of Medina is called Dhul Hulayfa. It's known today as Abiyar Ali. And you can find that just outside of Medina. It's about 6 miles from city center. For Sham, the Levant, Egypt, and the West, it's known as Al-Juhfa. And this is a village near the town of Rabigh. It's on the route from Medina to Mecca. It's now, during the time of the great imams, like Abdurrahman al-Ba'ali, was in ruins. He says, whoever assumes ihram from Rabigh has also entered into it slightly before the miqat. So you can enter into ihram before the miqat, no problem. It's just you can't breach the miqat's boundary and then enter into ihram without some form of penalty. Of Yemen is Yalamlam. It's a mountain range south of Mecca, designated for those coming from Yemen and nearby regions. Of the highlands of the Hijaz, the highlands of Yemen and Ta'if is Qarn. It's known as Qarn al-Manazil. It's also called Qarn al-Tha'alib. And this is about 1 day or night's travel from Mecca. This is the Miqat of those approaching from Najd and Ta'if. From the east is that Irq. And this is the known station for the people of Iraq and the eastern lands. It was named for a small mountain or patch of salty land known as Irq that produced a shrub called Tarfa. These apply to those respective inhabitants. So these are the mawaqit for those particular people, and also to everyone who passes by them. Meaning if you pass by those regions, then you have a particular miqat that you go to. So you don't have to be from that region to go to that miqat. No, if you're just coming in that general direction, then that is going to be your miqat. He says whoever's residence lies within them, meaning you're inside the boundary. So let's say the miqat forms a circle or an oval shape around Mecca. It basically forms a border around Mecca. So if you live within that border, within the mawaqit, then the miqat is from that point where you live. Anyone who lives closer to Mecca than the outer mawaqit assumes ihram from their home, as mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. Whoever is in Mecca enters ihram for Hajj from there, meaning from within Mecca itself. Because when you're in Mecca, you're likely in the haram. You're in the sanctuary, right? The miqat doesn't mark the sanctuary. In fact, you have a long way to go typically, especially from Dhul Hulayfa, from Medina. You have a long way to travel still before you even get to the borders of the sanctuary, let alone the masjid itself. Okay, but if you are living within Mecca, then that's where you make your ihram. It is also valid from outside the sacred boundary without a blood sacrifice. If a pilgrim in Mecca enters ihram for Hajj from a place outside the haram, from the sacred precinct such as Arafah, it is valid and no expiation is required, as the purpose of Hajj includes both sacred and non-sacred areas. Meaning they're in Mecca, but they're not in the haram. They're not already in the haram to make their ihram. They're actually outside of the haram and they're going to make the ihram. Basically saying they don't have to go out to the miqat to come back in. Ihram for Umrah, however, must be from outside the sacred boundary, meaning you have to be outside of the haram. Performing it from within Mecca is valid, but entails a blood sacrifice. So if you're in there within the within the haram of Mecca, and you do make ihram, you do make Umrah, basically you're putting your ihram in, having breached the miqat, then yeah, it's valid, but you have to perform there's a blood sacrifice. Right? So the rites of Umrah, Tawaf, Sa'i, and Halq, they take place inside the haram. So entering ihram for it must be from outside of the haram, like you go to Tan'im. And the Prophet ﷺ commanded Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr to take Aisha radiallahu anha to that location to enter ihram for Umrah. And they typically refer to that area. There's a Masjid Aisha, because that's the location of Tan'im. So if you were there, you're like, listen, you don't know where to go. You just say to the taxi driver or whatever, take me to Masjid Aisha. They're going to take you to Tan'im. Then you make your ihram from there, and then you come back into the haram and you perform the rites, and you're all good. If someone begins Umrah from inside Mecca, it remains valid, but remains a sacrifice for omitting the proper boundary. So a practical note here, as we wrap up, for those traveling by modern means of transportation, like you're going by air for most of us, we're traveling by a plane, the miqat still apply according to the same boundaries that the Prophet ﷺ designated. So anyone intending Hajj or Umrah must enter into ihram before crossing that point. It's what's considered muhadha, which is basically equivalent to where that is. Muhadha means like you're in line with it. So even if you're not crossing over that exact point on the map, but you are crossing over that border, like that invisible border around the region, if you're going to cross and breach that line, you have had to have entered into ihram prior to that. And most airlines will typically announce when that's approaching, giving people enough time in order to prepare themselves and enter into ihram. And what you could do beforehand is go through all of the recommended acts in terms of preparation, including putting on the garments that you're supposed to wear, and then you make your intention just before crossing over the border. And in this manner, you will avoid any compensatory sacrifice. Your compensation, or the dam, which he's referring to, compensatory sacrifice, or having to slaughter the animal. And that's where we wrap up for this session. Next time we get together, we'll start looking at the recommended acts for ihram in preparation to fulfill the rites and rituals. And then we'll move on to what it means to be in the state of ihram, what type of intention has to be made in order to make it, and then what type of hajj you're going to recommend, or is recommended, or that you can make, and then the various rules that pertain to that, and the offenses that can occur, and what you have to do in order to right those wrongs along the journey. Jazakallah khair wa sallallahu alaihi wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi.